827, 827, 827.
Radio Friends with episode 337, part 2 of our coverage of the classic and rather controversial Swedish black metal band Marduk. This time we're going through what I like to call the Legion years, that being Marduk albums 4 through 8, which feature one Eric Hadstedt, aka Legion, on vocals. You might be familiar with him as the vocalist on the second and better, in my opinion, of the two Ophthalmia albums, Via Dolorosa, which came out in 1995. I covered that band nearly 3 years ago on episode 207. But he's definitely most famous for being in Marduk. And in a lot of ways, he's kind of the Marduk vocalist, mostly because this is sort of the most important era of Marduk for their placement within black metal's sort of collective consciousness canon. Like, if you were to ask any random death metal or black metal fan on the street to describe what Marduk sounds like, even if they weren't themselves that too heavily into Marduk, they'd probably end up describing something that sounds a lot like a Legion era Marduk album. It's black metal ear candy, it's black metal comfort food, it's black metal for the sake of black metal. And not only that, it's also black metal that's primarily about black metal.
그리고 진짜 제가 해보고 싶은 게
What the hell do I mean by that?
Let's find out.
For starters, one thing that Marduk has always had going for them as far as credibility goes amongst the more mainstream black metal bands is that they were way more heavily involved in the early Nordic black metal scene during the time of controversies with the church burnings and the murders and whatnot than other bands of a similar commercial stature. I mean, the main guy in Marduk, Morgan Håkansson, when Dead from Mayhem offed himself and Euronymous collected up all the skull fragments and pieces of brain matter, he sent some of that in the mail to Morgan. Okay, he's been around forever. Not only that, but on the second Marduk album, Those of the Unlight, there's a song entitled Burn My Coffin. And on the third Marduk album, Opus Nocturne, there's a song called Materialized in Stone. Both of those were originally song titles that Dead had come up with during his time in Mayhem, before then changing Materialized in Stone to From the Dark Past and discarding the song title Burn My Coffin entirely. So there we go. That's a pretty good example of what I mean when I say Marduk is both black metal for the sake of black metal and black metal that is literally about black metal. That gets amped up even more during the Legion era of Marduk, which starts off with one of the best titled albums of all time, at least in a black metal context, Heaven Shall Burn When We Are Gathered. That's definitely black metal for the sake of black metal, because he literally took that album title from lyrics on the Bathory song Dies Irae, which featured the line, so not only had Marduk gone out of their way to pay tribute to one of the fallen early figures of second wave Nordic black metal by including all that stuff about Dead, they even jumped back to paying tribute to the first wave by literally titling their album after a Bathory lyrical couplet. Now this album was actually one of the first black metal albums I have ever heard, like way back when. And it still kind of sticks in my mind as like a really stereotypical, albeit not in a derogatory sense, example of black metal. But more importantly than that, it's also incredibly fucking brutal. As you're hearing right now, it's really fucking fast and really fucking punishing in how it cranks out those vaguely neoclassical sort of melodies. And then Legion's vocals kick in. And you can hear why he's kind of considered to be the Marduk vocalist, because he's got this really dry, unmistakably hateful tone that fits the binary, almost fascistic nature of the black metal brutality on display in the instrumentals, which is further enhanced by sections like this, where the band will momentarily pull back on the intensity before really hitting you with something even faster. It's a big compositional trick of this album that works entirely to the benefit of the atmosphere. Got another good example of that coming up here, which also shows off another very cool feature of this album, that being B-War's bass playing. Here you can hear him playing this kind of catchy cyclical melody under droning guitar chords. You don't really hear a lot of people talking about the great bass playing in Marduk, but honestly, it's one of their strong points, at least when B-War was in the band. That whole thing. Love it. Here's another full stop for the purpose of compositional tension. And then we go into the first song's coda, which shows off this really unique style of melody that permeates this album. There's a certain sort of darkly purple melodic sense that colors this album slightly differently, both from other black metal that was being put out at the time and even other Marduk albums. And I think a lot of it actually does stem from a certain form of Russian romantic classical music, specifically Mussorgsky. And indeed, Marduk saw fit to cover one of Mussorgsky's most famous musical pieces, Night on the Bald Mountain, in sort of a black metal rearrangement. It intros with a sample of the original orchestral score before then hitting you with a very powerful black metal restatement of that musical piece's central motif. And in fact, the first part of this song is a pretty faithful recreation of that Mussorgsky piece on distorted black metal guitar. It generally follows the narrative of the original Mussorgsky piece before transitioning via a little glissando into a more dogmatically black metal sort of thing, albeit one that still bases its guitar melodies around melodies from that original Mussorgsky piece, at least for its first half. After that, they do the thing where they pull back on the intensity before crashing back in, and they start utilizing more original melodies that the band themselves wrote that are still in keeping with the melodic character of the initial Mussorgsky piece. Also, this part coming up right here with the spooky narrative voice, it's dank as hell and it fucking owns, and if you don't like it, you're probably some kind of poser. Also, again, B-War's bass sounds fucking amazing here, playing those sick drone notes under the arpeggiated black metal chords. Then it goes back into, the original Mussorgsky melodies. It's a cool fucking song, but more importantly than that, it's sort of a statement of intent for this album. Like, pretty much every melody you're going to hear being played by a guitar on this album has its roots in that same sort of Mussorgskyan atmosphere, if that makes sense. You'd think an album with such a bullheaded dedication to being black metal for the sake of black metal wouldn't have a lot of variety on it, but Marduk actually does try out some weird variants on their sound with this album, specifically in the form of two very sort of binary two-riff songs that happen towards the album's end. The first of which, Darkness It Shall Be, is kind of their own take on the ultra-minimalist Von style of black metal, where you got one riff that's like this sort of ultra-primitive thing going on right here, and it keeps alternating with this sort of riff right here, where you got Legion spitting out all these vocals real fast, kind of like a black metal Tom Araya. Then it goes back into that first riff, and guess what? As the song goes on, it's just those two riffs over and over sort of bouncing off of each other as he's spewing these satanic litanies at you. Fellow Swedes Necrophobic had a very similar sort of Von tribute on their second album entitled Nailing the Holy One that came out around the same time. The other experimental sort of two-riff song on this album, Dracul va domni de now in Transylvania, or The Devil Will Rule Again in Transylvania, is actually a sequel to the song De me Quadenturan from their prior album Opus Nocturne. It's part of a larger conceptual cycle that tells the story of the historical Dracula, that being Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler. Can't really get more black metal than talking about Vlad the Impaler. And in fact, had this album been released today, I guarantee it would have come out on Satanic Warmaster's own Werewolf Records. It's very much in keeping with that atmosphere, despite what any anti-Marduk black metal elitists might want you to believe. Apologies, no offense meant, but come on, you know it's true. The two contrasting melodic motifs in this song are actually the closest that Marduk had ever gotten to doom metal at this point in their career. You've got this sort of descending, repetitive melodic staircase that starts the song out, which you're hearing right now, very gothic in its affectations. Then some narration to set the scene, letting you know what time period of history we're talking about, over a droning, sort of fading out guitar note. Then the other motif comes in, and the whole song is just going back and forth between those two motifs. It's actually very similar to Dark Throne's Quintessence off of their Panzerfaust album, albeit not nearly as brainy as that song was. So yeah, you got a couple little experimental tracks on this album, but the bulk of it does sound like that first sample I played, sort of this super fast, melodic, Mussorgskyan, unholy black metal. This includes my other favorite Marduk song besides the song Wolves off of their second album, Those of the Unlight, that being The Black Tormentor of Satan, which is probably the most hypnotic and trance-inducing in terms of guitar melodies on this album. And it's probably got Legion's most hateful sounding vocals that he ever recorded. Really fucking love his performance on this song. This whole song is super fucking catchy, but it also manages to conjure some really evil sounding darkness. It's definitely the most thoroughly composed song on the album for me. The melodies you're hearing right here definitely seem like something Mussorgsky could have come up with back in the 1860s, just being played on a black metal album. And then it goes into this slower section with that faster riff from the beginning of the song being repurposed as drone notes, leading us into my favorite bass guitar performance from Marduk. Like, if you didn't like that little melodic bass bit, I don't know what the fuck to tell you. Then the song does something pretty cool and unexpected. You know, it goes back into those fast parts from the beginning of the song, which are a pretty triumphant restatement of the song's initial intent, before then introducing some new melodies that lead us into a section that reminds me compositionally of the last song on the first Dismember album, In Death's Sleep, in that there's this whole little extra kind of mini song right at the end. This really epic turnaround, bringing in a whole new set of riffs and even kind of a whole new emotional feel to everything. Way more complex than what you would believe given Marduk's reputation. Also, this fade out. That shit was fucking sexy. Heaven Shall Burn When We Are Gathered. If you couldn't tell, it's definitely my favorite of the Legion era Marduk albums. I've been jabbering about it for the majority of this episode. But the 3 follow-up albums are also pretty cool and definitely play into my initial assessment of Marduk being a black metal band that creates black metal both for the sake of black metal as well as creating black metal that is about black metal. Because Heaven Shall Burn When We Are Gathered, that's a Bathory reference. They go even harder in the next 3 albums, that being Nightwing, Panzer Division Marduk, and Le Grand Danse Macabre, because all of these albums sort of form a thematic cycle, being about blood, fire, and death, which of course was the title of the 4th Bathory album that came out in 1988. The first of these albums, Nightwing, is the themed release. It's kind of split in 2 halves. The first half is very much a continuation of the Heaven Shall Burn When We Are Gathered style. It's super fucking fast, it's melodic, it's brutal. In fact, it might be a little bit more brutal than Heaven Shall Burn, but I kind of prefer the production on the former album to the more digital sound here. But speaking of that brutality, I actually sense a whole lot of death metal in this album, and it's not Swedish death metal either. If anything, with the way that they go through these very short riff cycles and how Legion stacks up his lyrics, a lot of this shit actually reminds me of Deicide, which might explain why Marduk is often seen as kind of being the black metal band that death metal people like. And it's definitely a pretty cool style, but I tend to prefer the second half of this album, which leans even harder into the blood theme by both being a little bit slower and more atmospheric, but also completing that conceptual cycle from the prior 2 albums, going through the life and times of Vlad Cepej. This half of the album has even more of a Bathory-esque feeling to it, at least to my ears. A lot of the melodic character put forward by these riffs reminds me of older mid-paced Bathory songs like Enter the Eternal Fire. In addition to that, there's some stylistic continuity with the German band Moonblood during their more mid-paced moments. Probably a case of Convergent Evolution more than anything else, and having a similar pool of influence they're drawing from. But this part right here, getting out of the more mid-paced bit, they're gonna bring in these really warlike, kind of droning melodic bits that for me constitute the peak of this album's artistry. This really martial sort of melody, which would continue on through the second half of the album and even into the outro, which samples the Romanian fascists' Iron Guard Legionary Workers' March, which was also kind of the start of Marduk being a controversial band, which would continue even more so with the part of their little Bloodfire Death trilogy, 1999's Panzer Division Marduk, which is kind of the most infamous Marduk album. One, it's got the word Panzer in it, so a lot of the more modernity conscious black metal fans are kind of scared of it.
Nobody knows who stole the chicken.
But 2, even amongst the less politically hand-wringing contingents of the black metal scene, this album is controversial for being kind of the birth of what is pejoratively termed Norsecore, that being the hyper-fast, very death metal adjacent style of black metal that kind of dominated the genre going into the 2000s through like the 2010s. A lot of black metal fans called this style Norsecore because they said that the focus on blast beats and speed, often to the detriment of the more consonant melodic bits, meant that it had more in common with grindcore than traditional Nordic black metal. Now, as far as an actual fusion of Nordic black metal and grindcore goes, as far as I'm concerned, that's called Night in Division 187, and that shit fucking rules. I don't know how you could hate Night in Division 187. See my Dawn episode, RFI 72 from 5 years ago for more info on that side project. That said, I don't really hear that much grindcore in Panzer Division Marduk as much as I hear, just straight up death metal, extremity, and aesthetics being applied to black metal. And it's definitely very fast and almost single-minded in its brutality, even compared to earlier releases from the boys in Marduk. But with that said, honestly, I actually find Heaven Shall Burn When We Are Gathered to be a lot more intense than this album, particularly when it comes to Legion's vocals. He seems a lot more robotic on this release compared to the really impassioned screams he did on Heaven Shall Burn, but also the production job on that album, particularly in terms of guitar, seemed a whole lot more malevolent and bone-chilling in its black metal affectations. This whole transition bit right here is definitely some very death metal-y sounding stuff. And I do like this album, alright? It's fine. It definitely does an interesting sort of fusion of single-minded death metal brutality and slightly more atmospheric melodic black metal stuff. There's just not too much I can say about it. Like what you heard there, that's pretty much the whole album. So if you liked it, yeah, get ready for half an hour of that, and it's pretty cool. But it's definitely my least favorite of the Bloodfire Death cycle, which I know is going to make some people upset. But that's just how I feel about this album. I almost wish they had gone a little bit more minimalist and a little bit crazier. Probably would have ended up with something like the aforementioned Night in Division 187, or maybe even Zyklon B from Norway. I would have enjoyed that more. Speaking of things I enjoy more than Panzer Division Marduk, the portion of the Bloodfire Death cycle, that being the Grande Danse Macabre, might actually be my favorite part of the trilogy. It's got plenty of shit on it that's just as fast as the stuff on Panzer Division Marduk, but the actual melodies during the fast parts have a little bit more character to them, at least to my ears, than they did on Panzer Division Marduk, harkening back a bit to that more defined melodic sense of Heaven Shall Burn When We Are Gathered. But the new direction that this album brings to Marduk's music is very interesting, consisting of two entirely new song types from these guys. The first of which will be minute to 2 minute long instrumental songs with a heavy doom metal flavoring. I know it's kind of a cliche to refer to any sort of extreme metal band doing something slower than they normally do as, you know, black metal Candlemass, death metal Candlemass. But Marduk put such an emphasis on these kind of harmonic, minor, mournful yet evil melodies that, yeah, I'm pretty sure Morgan was listening to a lot of Candlemass as inspiration for this album, and specifically tracks like this. As well as the second new variant on the Marduk sound, that being similarly slow-paced tracks, but instead of being minute to 2 minute long instrumentals, they're like these big 7 minute long behemoths, which appear to even use a fair bit of down tuning, which to my knowledge hadn't really been a part of Marduk's sound since their death metal days. It works really well with Legion's vocal approach, because instead of having to cram a whole bunch of words into one phrase like he did on the Panzer Division Marduk album, he can really expand over the slower paced riffs and kind of fill in the gaps between notes. Also, this transition section here is fucking amazing, and definitely redolent of a Candlemass influence, at least to my ears. And yet it's also an interesting repurposing of Marduk's melodic style in a more doom metal context. And it gives my boy B-War a chance to show off his melodic and textural skills, playing counter melodies on his bass against the more droning guitar notes. It kind of seems like Le Grand Danse Macabre is sort of the forgotten Marduk album of this era, but in terms of the Bloodfire Death trilogy, I'd say it's about tied with Nightwing, if not a little bit better, and definitely a whole lot more interesting to my ears than Panzer Division Marduk. Alas, for me, this really was a grand dance of death, because after this album came out, the later Marduk stuff I just don't really care about. Their big drummer, Fredrik Andersson, with his very unique style, ended up leaving, as did B-War after one final album, which was also the final album with Legion on vocals, that being World Funeral, upon which it kind of seems like his vocals sort of shat out, sad to say. I mean, he'd really been shredding his throat through most of the 90s, so it's understandable, but after that, he kind of mostly just focused on his career as a tattoo artist while occasionally doing guest vocals for bands like Witchery once in a while. As for the later albums with Ariok on vocals, I know some people are really into them, but honestly, I'd just rather listen to the first two albums from his other band, Funeral Mist. Later, Marduk just never really caught my attention the same way the earlier albums did. That said, if Marduk ever did come through here on some kind of tour, I'd definitely go see them live. And 7 classic albums in a row is way better than most black metal bands can claim. Honestly, I would consider Marduk to be somewhat underestimated, and on their good albums, they got some really sick shit. Hopefully you agree with me on that, but even if you didn't, thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
When you add all these toppings to a street chalupa, It's gonna get heavy in the sauce game. It's gonna get heavy in the messy topping game. Your hands, you're gonna need napkins.